In the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany began a relentless aerial campaign against Britain. Fresh from victory over France, the Luftwaffe expected a swift and decisive victory. But what followed was a turning point in the Second World War. Against what appeared to be impossible odds, Britain held firm. So what went wrong for the Germans? Well, to find out, we spoke to Dr. Victoria Taylor, a historian specialising in the Luftwaffe.
Today we are in the operations room at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, the nerve centre of Duxford's defence during the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain, of course, is an iconic aerial campaign, but so often we focus on the Anglo-centric story. Today we're going to be moving into looking at the Battle of Britain, but from the German perspective, where they're quite as invincible as is often presented.
By July 1940, Nazi Germany had already swept through much of Europe. France and the Low Countries had fallen in a matter of weeks, but Britain refused to surrender. Now Hitler planned to attack. The Luftwaffe's job was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, gain control of the skies, and pave the way for an invasion.
The German Luftwaffe is riding high on the wave of success. But even though there's this sense of jubilation at this so-called wonder of 1940, the actual reality and the toll for the Luftwaffe's airmen is quite different. They have sustained losses along the way. 30% of their bomber force, 30% of their dive bombers, and 20% of their precious Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters by the end of the fall of France. Hermann Göring, of course, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, is hoping that the Luftwaffe can clear the skies of Britain within a matter of weeks. But for some of the war-cut men, the British Spitfires that they had encountered over Dunkirk said otherwise, and they knew that now, in the Battle of Britain, those dogfights were going to be fiercer than ever.
And it wasn't just British aircraft. The Royal Navy remained the largest in the world, capable of inflicting devastating losses on any German invasion fleet. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force had a revolutionary air defence network known as the Dowding System. Furthermore, while Britain is often said to have fought alone, in reality it could call on help from its empire, the United States, and from people with governments in exile in the UK. All of this meant that defeating Britain would be very difficult. Was the Luftwaffe leadership really up for the task?
Now, Göring, of course, was a liability. He was a haphazard commander, he was a grandiose narcissist that was very much trapped still in the First World War. Next to Göring, of course, there are Hugo Sperler and Albert Kesselring. Hugo Sperler is far more cautious, he's conservative. Albert Kesselring is far more reckless and a bit more impulsive. So when you've got these two egos tussling, along with also being eclipsed by that of Göring's, you can see the potential for trouble. The RAF's fighter command was spearheaded by Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who was ably assisted by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of 11 Group, the group that was particularly heavily targeted during the Battle of Britain. Heading 12 Group, meanwhile, was Trafford Leigh-Mallory. The rivalries between the men are infamous. But what's important is that they did pull together when Britain needed it. They were careful to keep the right reserves and to make sure that Britain and Fighter Command continued to tick over during the Battle of Britain.
The German campaign began on the 2nd of July 1940, when they began to attack shipping in the English Channel. This Kanalkampf, or Channel Battle, was the first phase of the Battle of Britain.
The Channel Battle is often skipped over by historians and observers, but actually it's a really important phase. The Luftwaffe launches around 1,300 sorties. It sinks a lot of shipping, and it does worry the British enough that sometimes they do have to actually halt some of the shipping going through the Strait of Dover in daylight hours. The Channel Battle is trying to put that political pressure on Britain as well as the military pressure, but it's also trying to gauge just what is happening in this strange watery no man's land.
After 5 weeks of fighting with heavy losses on both sides, the Germans were ready to step up their attacks. They launched the next phase of the battle, the Adlerangriff, or Eagle Attack, on the 13th of August 1940, known as Eagle Day. The aim was to destroy vital British infrastructure like airfields, radar installations and aircraft factories, but it did not get off to an auspicious start.
In the morning, there's a miscommunication between German bombers and the fact that the crystals in their radios have not been upgraded to be compatible with that of the fighter aircraft. As a result, they are now heading into the lion's den without their fighter escorts, and the massacre was painful. The Germans do pick up a bit more momentum in the afternoon of Eagle Day. They are hitting at some of the radar stations, they are making sure that they are hitting some of the aircraft on the ground. But it is not the absolute monumental day they've been hoping for. Just 2 days later, the Germans suffer what's known as Schwarzer Donnerstag, or Black Thursday. Rather than setting its talons into Britain, its wings are being clipped.
The intensity of the fighting continued to grow, with combined losses peaking on the 18th of August, known as the hardest day. Southern England was now a battlefield, with hundreds of aircraft forming massed melees in the sky. The costs were high, but the Germans felt that they were pushing the British to the brink of defeat. The problem was, they were wrong.
Both sides were plagued by intelligence failures during the Battle of Britain. Major Beppo Schmidt, for instance, he was Göring's yes man, so he would often distort the numbers and tell Göring exactly what he wanted to hear, underestimating the British numbers. Kesselring was convinced by the beginning of September 1940 that the RAF's fighter command was pretty much wiped out. Sperler, on the other hand, estimated that it was closer to 1,000 aircraft, which was nearer. The British had around 600 to 700 fighters left, so this hugely changed the dynamics of the Battle of Britain for the Luftwaffe.
The problems didn't end there. German airfields in occupied territory were only half built and were in need of repair. German aircraft, which had proved useful in previous campaigns, like the Bf-110 and Ju-87 Stuka, were having their flaws exposed. And when British aircraft were shot down, the pilots could simply bail out over friendly territory and return to the fight within hours, while German pilots shot down in battle were lost for good. However, the biggest problem for the Luftwaffe was the English Channel itself.
The famous Bf-109 fighter pilot Ulrich Steinhilper, for instance, described this phenomenon of Kanalkrankheit, or channel sickness. Now, this was an unusual case of seeing this increase in the consumption of alcohol, cigarettes, losing weight, diarrhea, depression, all of these different elements that were directly linked to the strain of flying over the English Channel. Fear of a watery death, whether through hypothermia or through drowning, was so pronounced in the Luftwaffe that sometimes the airmen took up pistols into the air in case they needed to end it all. And even by Eagle Day itself, there's a fascinating letter from a junior doctor in a Luftwaffe bomber wing where he says that we need to be relieved by the autumn of 1940 or our nerves will be shot.
As August continued, the Luftwaffe did start to get their act together, and towards the end of the month, the loss ratio began to equalise between the two sides. But the battle was about to take yet another twist. On the 24th of August, German aircraft accidentally dropped some stray bombs on London. This prompted Winston Churchill to launch a retaliatory raid on Berlin on the 25th of August. Enraged, Göring began a reprisal of his own and shifted German attacks away from airfields towards London. He hoped to destroy British morale and draw the RAF into a decisive air battle, but the decision was a disaster.
Göring has jumped the gun. He's gone too fast. The Luftwaffe are not ready for that kind of protracted aerial campaign. Not only are they letting the RAF airfields now breathe and recuperate, but also they're now having to stretch themselves to the very limits. The Bf-109s have been using up 2/3 of their fuel capacity anyway, getting to Britain and getting back to occupied Europe. Now it's been constrained even more. It was 20 to 30 minutes in the active combat zone. Over London, it's just 10 minutes. Moreover, they have the complexity of the fact that not only are they escorting the German bombers, but also Göring is somehow expecting the fighter pilots to draw up the last reserves of the RAF at the same time. So who can actually carry out this impossible task?
This new aerial offensive against British cities became known as the Blitz. For the first time, British civilians were on the front lines of the Second World War. But far from breaking their morale, the British public maintained their resolve. Instead, after months of fighting without rest, it was the Luftwaffe that was pushed to breaking point.
What's important to bear in mind is actually the Luftwaffe are feeling the strain too. British aircraft production had pulled out in front during 1940, and they'd managed to churn out over 1,000 more fighters during that year than the Germans. The British also had meaningful reserves, which the Germans didn't have. Even though Britain did struggle with a chronic lack of pilots during the Battle of Britain, its shortfall was normally about 10%. For the Germans, it was a third, and they ultimately continued to struggle to not only replace their pilots, but also to replace all of their aircraft, including the bombers that took so many more man-hours to produce.
On the 15th of September, the Luftwaffe launched their largest attack yet on the City of London. They hoped that this would finally shatter the RAF and pave the way for an invasion. Instead, the British deployed their full force and repelled the assault.
The aerial insurrection that comes here, the fact that the British throw up so many more fighters than the Germans even realised still existed, is a huge blow to the Luftwaffe's morale. As Otto Bechler, who is a Luftwaffe bomber pilot, says, they actually come home from the 15th of September 1940, and he says there's drunken parties, they're weeping for comrades, and actually it's so bad for them that there is a huge rocketing in its suicide rates. The Germans actually see nearly 80 suicide attempts or suicides between the middle of September 1940 into October 1940. The Germans have felt such exhaustion about this campaign. They cannot sustain it much longer. And as we get towards the end of October 1940, the daylight portion of the raids starts to peter out and make way for the nighttime offensive.
Realising the battle was lost, Hitler postponed his invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe continued the nighttime bombing of British cities until 1941, when their focus switched to supporting the German invasion of the Soviet Union.
So why did the Luftwaffe fail to win the Battle of Britain? Well, ultimately, it was a mixture of issues. From the beginning, its vision was completely splintered. This is what caused all of this up and down and around over its choices as to what to target. It also suffered from a number of intelligence failures, but ultimately, it was simply just too much of a stretch. They were having to contend with flying over the channel there and back, day after day, month after month, until its airmen broke down. The Luftwaffe wore itself into the ground during the Battle of Britain. It tried to do too much, and ultimately it achieved too little.